The first Mishnah of chapter 7 of Masechet Shabbat deals with the question of how many sacrifices, how many offerings must be brought, how many karbanot, if you violate Shabbat. The question is simple if you just violated Shabbat one time by doing one thing. But what happens if you violated Shabbat many times with many different things? How many different, melachot, many different types of work? How do you calculate how many offerings one would need to bring? Do you bring one goat, one she-goat, yearling, or must you bring many goats? So the first scenario is you forgot the entire concept of Shabbat, meaning you didn't know that there is something called Shabbat and that you kind of once heard of it when you were young, and then for many years you kind of totally forgot about Shabbat. And 10 years later you're like, hey, I've been violating Shabbat for 10 years now. How many times did I violate Shabbat? Like each Shabbat I've done many melachot. So now I did it all by mistake because I forgot about Shabbat. How many karbanot do I have to bring? Do I have to bring a whole bunch of them? So the answer is, how many mistakes did you make? You made one mistake. You forgot the entire idea of Shabbat. One mistake, one thing that you did kind of wrong by mistake was you forgot Shabbat, and therefore you bring only one karban for all those Shabbatot. Even if it was 10 years worth of Shabbat, and each Shabbat was many times, it's only one karban. Why? Because there was one mistake that was made. The second case, you know about Shabbat, you didn't forget the idea of Shabbat, but you didn't realize that today is Shabbos. So you thought, you had your calendar mixed up, and you thought that Shabbat was on Monday, and that, Shabbat came around, you're like, you didn't realize that it was Shabbat. So many Shabbatot this happened. You didn't know that it was Shabbat. You thought it was another day of the week, and you went about and did work, all kinds of work. So how many do you bring in such a case? The answer is one per Shabbat. Why? Because each Shabbat that you mixed up and you didn't realize that it was Shabbat is considered to be a separate mistake. But whatever happened on that Shabbat, it's all just part of that one mistake that you didn't realize that day is Shabbat. Third case, today is Shabbat, but you forgot that this kind of work is not allowed in Shabbat. You thought it's okay to do this type of work or these types of work. So how many karbanot would you bring then? The answer is you bring one for each category of work. So if you did some writing, for example, and you did some plowing, and you did some other melachot, so one for each type of work that you did. For each category of work, you bring one. And the fourth scenario, which is really the same scenario, but you did many different actions of melachot, but they were all part of the same melacha family or the same melacha category. For example, you kindled the fire with your matches, but you also kindled the fire. You had an existing fire and you put some food to cook on it. You also were puffing a cigarette and making the fire get bigger. You're also, warming up your house. So you did a lot of different kinds of things, but they are all from the same category of making a fire. So how many karbanot would you bring if you forgot that you're not allowed to make a fire? One, because all of these different ways of making a fire are all part of one category, which is the melacha of making a fire. So even if you did many different times make a fire, and each one was, many details there, all of those details are part of one melacha, one mistake, and therefore if you forgot that you're not allowed to light a fire in Shabbat, and you did a whole bunch of types of fire, it's only one karban for all of them. And that is the first Mishnah of Perek Zayin, first Mishnah of chapter 7 of Shabbat. And the Mishnah calls it a klal gadol, the great rule, or the big rule when it comes to karbanot that you bring for messing up with violating Shabbat by mistake.